Okay, I think we're about ready to start. There might be a few more people join us in the next few minutes, but I'm sure they'll be able to catch up. So good morning and good afternoon to all of you from around the world who are joining us today. I'm seeing a really diverse audience from the likes of the UK, America, Kazakhstan, Spain, Peru, Nigeria, just to name a few. So a real diverse audience. Welcome to our second instalment of Taking Integrity Online, which is a special three-part series to help you as our educators uphold academic integrity as we look toward what could be a permanent future of blended learning. So for this special three-part series, we've partnered with higher education integrity specialists from the University of Northampton, Nottingham Trent University and Loughborough University, who are all actively managing the new challenges of upholding academic integrity in predominantly a remote environment. And while this change is something that none of us planned for, just being here today, we're taking that first step towards a successful transition. So my name is Laura Young, and I'm Turnitin's communication specialist for the EMEA region. I'm based here in the UK, and I'm usually in our Newcastle office, but right now you can find me at home in Sunderland, which is just across the water. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Dr. Mark Sargent from Nottingham Trent University in the UK. Mark is a senior lecturer in psychology and also the academic integrity coordinator for both the Department of Psychology and the School of Social Sciences at Nottingham Trent. So very welcome, Mark. So Mark chairs the institutional group on academic integrity and has both presented at and chaired a total of over 500 academic integrity panels. So we're joined by a lot of experience today. So just before we make a start, really quite boring, but I'd like to cover just some basic webinar housekeeping rules, just so that you're all in the know. So today's session will last no longer than 45 minutes. All attendees will be muted for the entirety of the webinar, but you can use the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions to Mark that you'd like to be addressed at the end. And we ask that you only use the chat to say hello rather than ask specific questions, because the chat can be a little bit difficult to follow. And for any questions that we might deem unsuitable for broadcast, facilitators are on hand in the background to respond to you. Our facilitator today is Jamie, so you might see his name pop up throughout. And I'm also pleased to advise that the recording of the webinar will be available in around 48 hours from now. And of course, we will send you an email to let you know that it's available. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'd just like to give you an overview of exactly why we're here today. So education is facing challenges that I guess at the beginning of 2020, we really would never have envisaged. Institutions have had to adjust their entire structures, and for educators, this has meant being thrust into distance learning environments without any time to plan for such an enormous change. Of course, we're in this unprecedented situation and educators everywhere are encountering their valid concerns. One question is, how do you uphold academic integrity when students are not physically within the academic setting, the normal academic setting? And Deborah mentioned in our previous webinar last week with Robin Crockett that the transition to remote learning is really stressful for students who are so used to the usual routine of physically attending classes. And when students are stressed and they can lack connection to learning, to their teachers, they start to struggle. That can lead to them becoming more tempted to take shortcut solutions like cheating, whether that can be common types of plagiarism or newer forms such as contract cheating. And while upholding academic integrity definitely includes introducing preventative measures, it also includes efficiently dealing with that administrative aftermath of academic misconduct or potential academic misconduct, such as integrity panel hearings, which in itself is an educational meeting and an opportunity for students to learn. So the first thing that may come to mind when we think about this is surely it's just a matter of having a reliable video conferencing tool and we're set. And I'm sure Mark is sitting shaking his head. Yes, he's smiling quite widely right now at the very naive statement that I've just made. But obviously I am saying that in jest. You do need a good video tool in the process, but well, we'll find out very soon that this is only one element of the panel hearing that we need to consider. For example, how do we deal with evidence that is usually paper-based in a panel hearing? How do we ensure the panel is conducted in a professional and robust manner? How can we make it meaningful yet efficient? And also, how can we use this unfounded situation as an opportunity to make the whole misconduct investigation process better and more streamlined? So today, in an exclusive interview, Dr. Mark Sargent will provide some anecdotal tips and advice to help two types of academic institutions, which I'm sure you'll fit into. Those who haven't yet moved to remote hearings, or those who have already moved online but could do with some advice for the new academic year, which, as we know, is going to look an awful lot different to last. So as you can see on my screen right now, we'll run through the challenges and how to overcome them for remote panels, and we'll look at some analytics and observations from Mark, and then we'll move to a Q&A with our attendees. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go. And we'll get started. So, hello, Mark.
Good afternoon.
Hello. Just before we get into the bones of the webinar, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here today, please?
Sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Academic Integrity Coordinator for the Department of Psychology at Nottingham Trent University, which is, I think, pretty much the biggest psychology department in the UK. I'm also the Academic Integrity Coordinator for the School of Social Sciences, and I lead our institutional working group on academic integrity issues. As you very kindly mentioned, I've got a lot of experience, several years and over 500 panels under my belt, and I'm concerned with making sure that our processes, our panels run as smoothly and efficiently as possible. Now, as with everybody else, we had to move our academic misconduct panels online at pretty short notice. But all of this required some very careful planning and consideration to make sure that the panels ran effectively and efficiently. And from your very kind invitation, I'm here today to share some of the good practice that I've developed over the last 6 months.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess, well, institutions globally have had to move to online academic panel hearings with very limited time and resources. So we are very interested in hearing about how you've managed to wade your way through this initial struggle at Nottingham Trent, but also turn it into a positive transformation. I've heard about a lot of your successes. So before we go there, I just really wanted to ask a little bit of a separate question, as I wonder if you've noticed a rise in the number of cases or panels you're conducting since education moved online, and do you think there's a link between academic misconduct and remote learning?
Sure. So we're currently at about 85 misconduct panels within the school. So we've still got the summer referral period where students are finishing up bits of work they haven't passed. So I would estimate we've probably hit somewhere between 90 and 100 by the end of the year. That's maybe a 15 to 20% increase on what we've seen over the last few years. So I think there's two factors there. The first one is I completely agree with Robin and your summarising of his comments that without the usual structure and level of support, students might be tempted to make or to choose a couple of shortcuts. Also, given the stressful situation that everybody's under, things like time management and effective planning have definitely taken a hit. And I know from experience that a number of students, when it comes down to the panic of getting work handed in, basically might decide to take that shortcut and, submit something which is questionable. It's also worth pointing out that given that so many staff are working from home, we've got a lot better at actively monitoring kind of the electronic submissions that we look for, reviewing Turnitin similarity reports, and even potentially picking up cases of contract cheating. So I'd say we've seen an increase, possibly due to motivations, but also staff getting better at detecting these things. We've also seen a pretty noticeable increase in the number of what we call, somewhat unfortunately, PAPs, which are poor academic practice notifications. So these are things that aren't problematic enough to be in a panel, but do represent poor scholarship. And we've seen maybe a 25% increase in these over the last 6 months or so.
Well, I do believe that student stress and that sense of isolation at this particular time, it can be a huge trigger for academic misconduct. And it's something that, as you've noted, it is important to monitor more closely at this time, even though it's quite unfortunate that we have to do so. So, stating the obvious, remote panels mean no real face-to-face interaction. But how have you been able to uphold that same level of interaction with students as you did before? And what sort of challenges have you encountered along the way?
So there have been definitely several challenges, and the key thing, I think, as with most things in life, is proper planning and preparation. So you mentioned earlier about having a good online communication tool. That is important, but it's also, you've got to consider the limitations of these sorts of communication platforms. So only one person can speak at once. You have to keep your microphones muted a lot of the time because of the background noise of pets and children and people getting up to things around you. The speed of the internet connection that people have. I was in a meeting a few weeks ago and Virgin Media basically fell apart for most of South London, so a lot of people dropped out of the meeting. So there's lots of practical considerations, but what we did was we consulted pretty extensively before we kind of came up with the system that we're using at the moment. So we spoke to colleagues in academic registry within our institution. They oversee the regulations to do with academic integrity. I've always maintained very close links with our students' union, and I know you've got a webinar coming up on that pretty soon. So we consulted about making sure that they were happy with the procedures we were putting in place. And I was actually very fortunate. A colleague I work with over in our law school is a practicing magistrate, and they have a slight history of running online hearings or online panels themselves. So I basically looked to see if they've ever experienced any problems that we could learn from. Now, one of the particular issues that was on my mind in terms of the number of panels was what we call cognitive load. So I'm a psychologist, and I know that running these kind of meetings is actually really draining, because you're constantly watching what you say, you're monitoring other people, and it's a really common thing that people will do a day of Zoom meetings and just be absolutely exhausted by the end of it. So we always try to make sure we do a maximum of 2 back-to-back panels and an absolute maximum of 4 of them within a day, just so people are fresh and able to take the information in. We also, quite early on, produced a guide to online etiquette, or netiquette, if you will, to help students and staff prepare for the panels and know what's expected of them.
Okay, netiquette, yes, very good. And you've listed quite a few challenges, which I guess not everybody would have considered. There's definitely a lot more to the process than just having that good video tool. So let's go and focus a little bit more closely on communication, because of course it is extremely key in this setting. It's pretty much all we're focusing on. Have you noticed a difference in student interaction when comparing remote to face-to-face panels?
Yes, I'd actually say there's been a significant improvement, which is quite nice to see. So just the key principle you've always got to bear in mind is allowing students to express themselves clearly and confidently in these panels. And what I've definitely noticed is a significant improvement in student interactions during the meeting. So they felt a lot more comfortable answering questions, they felt a lot more confident presenting themselves. I think part of that is when you're presenting in your own environment, and you can kind of dress quite informally in some ways. It's quite relaxing. Students are also very used to communicating using kind of electronic media, social media. So in some ways it kind of put them at their ease when they are communicating with each other. Now, one thing we did debate for a while is whether to give students the option to dial in with their camera or not. When you're doing misconduct meetings, it's often really useful to be able to see the facial reactions and expressions of people when you're talking to them about issues. But some students who've experienced quite high levels of anxiety have actually requested not to dial in using their cameras, and we try to be accommodating with this. Nonetheless, we do find that most students are happy to dial in on video. They've been more candid and articulate, and it can really help to reduce kind of the official intimidating nature of the panels. It's basically worked extremely well, and just as a final point, a number of students have struggled with internet connection, particularly in rural areas. So allowing them to dial in without their cameras on has actually very much increased the speed of the meeting and the communication abilities of students.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, you know, you can be in the different countries that we have here today. I'm sure some of those countries might experience difficult connections, especially for remote institutions. So that's a really great point and a piece of advice. Just referring back to the levels of anxiety that students can feel, this whole experience for students, regardless of accountability in the process, must be really intimidating. And we're all feeling very isolated right now. So to have a misconduct hearing to attend on top of this must be daunting. And it's important to make the student feel as comfortable as possible in the situation, which I guess will improve their communication. It'll make them more open to you know, telling their story, whether that be a story which puts them in maybe a more difficult position than before, but at least they're being honest. So how do you maintain the same level of support for students both before and after panel hearings, since the whole administrative process is now online? And I guess it's quite important to try and bridge that gap as much as possible.
Sure. So one of the things we've actually used for a number of years, and we've improved on recently given the online or the move online, we use support booklets for students before and after the panels that they take part in. So I found from experience that students often have questions about what happens, who's invited to the panel, how should they conduct themselves, where they can go to for advice. And we send these booklets out as standard practice, one for before the panel and then one for after panels have taken place. We've also gone to great lengths to make sure the books are written in plain English rather than academic English, so that students can access and engage with the information, basically. We make it standard practice now. Students receive the formal invitation to a panel, but we immediately follow up on that with an email just going, are you okay? Do you have any questions about this? So students, and I'd say at least half or 2/3 of students reply and ask for some guidance on this kind of information. So we do this before and after panels to make sure that students, although it's not a pleasant experience doing a misconduct panel, students do feel supported and they've got somebody that they can actually talk to through this process.
Yeah, I mean, follow-ups are a fantastic idea. I was a student what feels like a long time ago now, and I know I'd feel very lost in the process if I didn't receive an appropriate level of correspondence. And just that, are you okay? It goes a long way for someone that's feeling a little anxious about the situation. So let's move on a little bit to the physical panel hearing, and in that I envisage a lot of paper being passed back and forth, being shuffled through, and that's because it's known to be a very traditional process. It's a hearing until now, obviously. So how have you managed to go paper free in a panel hearing?
I'd say this is actually the move online has been one of the biggest advantages for sharing of evidence in these panels. So you're right, in a traditional panel, we'd have kind of the panel members and the student and their representative. Everybody's got a big stack of paper that they have to refer to. You've got to be quite careful pointing out what stuff you're looking at and when. Whereas in an online panel, it's fantastic because you can just share your screen if you're presenting a case, and you can actually show the Turnitin similarity report and say, we're concerned about this source number one. If you click on the link, it takes you through to this paper. If we scroll down to the reference list, this information is not included, or it is included. And it's just fantastic. Everybody's looking at the same information, seeing everything in explicit detail. And basically, you've got a single narrative. There's no confusion. There's no questions about, sorry, what page are you referring to? And it's streamlined the entire process, and it's really cut down on our photocopying costs as well, which is nice.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess having that live source of evidence, it removes any kind of ambiguity from the process. If the student was to say, oh no, I don't know what you're talking about, or I can't remember that, then you can just point them straight to it, and it relieves any sort of back and forth after the meeting where you have to follow up, okay, well, this is what we were referring to. So I agree that sounds it sounds really effective. And I suppose it's more efficient than having to scramble through the wads of paper. Some papers might be missing, and the student might not be able to find the paper you're referring to. So would you say that viewing the similarity report on a live basis, why would you say that is so effective?
It's like I say, it's the standardized viewing of material, being able to follow up each individual source as you need to. So sometimes students will present an explanation or an alternative, which in a physical face-to-face panel you can't investigate, whereas you can look at that immediately when you're in an online panel. And not only that, we can also bring up and share the regulations, the policies and procedures that we work with really easily with a click of a button. If a student claims that they accidentally submitted something to the wrong online folder or Dropbox, we can investigate that immediately. And it's streamlined the entire process, and it's just made it so much more concrete, which is, for when you're in a decision-making kind of position where the evidence is maybe a little bit ambiguous, it's just made it so much easier. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of makes you stop and wonder why you didn't go down this route in the first place. But it takes a global pandemic to do that, doesn't it? Yeah. So while you're currently managing the successful panels in the psychology and social sciences department, I wonder, have you been able to standardize this process across different departments?
So standardizing things I think it's one of the key issues that people face when they're trying to promote academic integrity. So different staff will interpret issues in different ways. Some people are very punitive. They want to pick up on any potential issue. Some members of staff are incredibly lenient because they either don't want to do the paperwork themselves, or they don't want to get their students into trouble. So the key thing for this whole thing that I implemented in the School of Social Sciences is oversight. So within each of the 4 departments and 2 institutes in our school, we've got designated academic integrity coordinators. So I'm the one for psychology. And these departmental representatives are kind of trained to standardize the decision-making process. So the issues that are kind of faced are handled in a consistent way. And this is one of the key things. All students should receive exactly the same treatment, regardless of the courses that they're on. So I provide regular training and update for people chairing the panels, the panel members, school representatives who are presenting evidence, and I've produced lots and lots of standardized documentation. So when people are presenting or preparing their evidence, when people are trying to present a particular type of issue like plagiarism, collusion, or contract cheating, they know exactly what kind of things that the panel will need to hear. And one of the kind of great ways I know this has been a success is we monitor not only the number of panels, but the percentage that are upheld as opposed to thrown out for, being too ambiguous. Before I took over, it was roughly a third of our panels weren't upheld. And since I've standardized things, we're over 95%. So it means fewer students going to panels when they don't need to be there, which is obviously a good thing.
Yeah, 100%. And have you made any adaptations that could be transferable into physical hearings, whenever that may be? Obviously, we don't know, but I'm sure at some stage in the future, we will return to maybe that blended setting where you'll have physical interaction.
Sure. So, we ask for very detailed information to be provided to students in advance of the panel. So the evidence provided by the lecturing staff with concern is now incredibly detailed. We encourage all students to submit a very detailed statement in advance of the panels where they express their version of events and give some context to what they think might have happened. Now, this was done before, and we did encourage students to do this, but given the move to online panels, we've really kind of pushed this and tried to encourage students. So with an online panel, you need to make sure that students have clear information on the potential issues. A statement from the student means that they can express themselves at length about the potential issues that they've had. And introducing kind of things like an online etiquette has really helped to streamline the discussion. So if we move online, so when we move back to some more face-to-face meetings, we're going to maintain that focus on the structured documentation, the statements in advance, and definitely a bit of an etiquette guide as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So we obviously talked about the netiquette or the etiquette standards you set to help. So can you tell me just a little bit more about those standards that have helped to streamline the hearing?
Sure. So we produce two documents actually. So the first one is it's a standard guide for installing and using Microsoft Teams, which is the platform we use, so that everybody can access the panels effectively. There's nobody kind of dialing in 2 minutes before the panel and saying, how the hell do I actually get on this thing? And then in terms of the panel itself, we remind people that only one person can speak effectively at once. We ask people to mute their microphones to avoid background noise. We encourage everyone to keep their questions and answers pretty concise while still being able to express themselves. We do try and cut down on the waffle a bit where possible. Yeah. We try and make sure that the environment that everybody's in is private and they're not going to be disturbed. And it's encouraging things like being professional, so making sure that people are dressed, which surprisingly has come up as an issue. Encouraging people not to swear, but to kind of speak professionally. And it's just conducting yourself in a professional manner, basically.
Yeah, I think that's all very relatable. As our attendees right now who've switched to remote teaching and working in general, I'm sure they're all nodding in agreement at the level of difficulty they've experienced when trying to execute successful Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams calls over the past few months. But when it comes to panel hearings in particular, setting those core standards before the meeting even begins, it really sets the conversation up for success, and it communicates an expectation and adds that sense of formality to the hearing, which I guess can be difficult to instill when a student isn't physically with you. They're instead in their bedrooms, living rooms, kitchens, with all manner of things happening in the background. So with all of that said, and the successes that you've noticed, how do you plan to move forward in the next academic year, which is very soon? It's, I think, just over a month away. Have you learned anything, and what might you change in the process?
Sure. So, I think the key thing to bear in mind is that things had to move online pretty quickly. And I'm sure everybody involved today, and pretty much everybody involved in academic irregularity or academic integrity panels, did the best job that they could. But it's good to review these things on a rolling basis and to see what's worked and what hasn't worked. So I'm, in a week or two's time, I'm holding an online meeting with our chairs, panel members, and quite crucially, our administrators who handle all of the work behind the scenes, just to make sure that, we've accurately captured what worked, what didn't work, what we need to tweak for next time round. One thing I was a bit worried about was that staff might have been very lenient with the move to online panels. It's a new format, so people might have been giving slightly lighter penalties, but I've done some digging into the data and that doesn't seem to be the case, which is great. We've found, so our meetings are structured, there's a meeting between the panelists just to review the evidence, then the students join us, and then the students leave and we make a decision on what we think has happened. We've noticed that because all the documentation is so thoroughly prepared, we only need 5 minutes at the start of the meeting to review it. So we're planning on cutting down the panel discussion time and expanding the length of time we have to talk to the students and find out what's going on. We're definitely increasing our focus on case preparation and detailing the potential issues from staff, and we're really pushing the idea of receiving detailed statements from students as well. That's been incredibly useful. And then finally, we've always signposted students to sources of support before and after panels, but we're going to try and increase that basically going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think support really is key. And Robin Crockett last week, he mentioned in his contract cheating webinar that we do have a duty of care for students, or teachers have a duty of care for their students, regardless of the students' actions. And he said that we need to persuade them back to honest endeavour before cheating habits get embedded. And I think that that is really pertinent because it takes the policing element out of the whole process and it replaces it with compassion and support. And I'm sure that everybody will agree to that today. And actually, as you've already mentioned, Mark, we'll talk more about student support and involving the student union in the investigation process with Sandy Dan and Kit Messenger from Loughborough University next week, talking about how we can translate documentation to make it student friendly, which again adds that extra level of support during such an anxious time. So we're at 12:35, which is perfect timing. Before we move into our quick attendee Q&A, I know you've prepared a few slides to share your final thoughts. So I have the slides, so I'll start sharing my screen, but you can take the reins. So I'll just share now. And hopefully you can see that from your end, Mark.
I can, yeah.
Great, so yeah, take it away.
Okay, so I just wanted to go through a few analytics. Previously, when we had face-to-face panels, it was approximately a quarter, 25% of students didn't attend and engage with the panels. This is really noticeably dropped to about 10% of students not attending and engaging with the panels, which it's a fantastic thing. Allowing students to come forward and present their arguments and actually being able to ask them questions, it means that you can dig deeper and actually be a lot more confident in the decisions that you make. So of the 65 panels we've held remotely, 57% of involved students attending. It's worth pointing out that roughly 5% of non-attendance is linked to students being key workers, particularly in the care sector, given that we're the School of Social Sciences. Approximately 75%, 3/4 of our students now submit a detailed statement in advance of the panel explaining the issues that they faced, and that's compared to maybe 25% when it was face-to-face panel. So this is excellent. This allows us to get a real kind of firm grip on what the potential issues are from the student's perspective. So just some kind of key takeaway messages. So I think all of the speakers for the webinars would agree that you have to prioritize a developmental and supportive approach. Effectively, one way you can approach this is to say, how do we stop students from cheating? The more effective way is actually, how do we make sure students are learning appropriately? Given the pressures that everybody's faced, it's not unusual to find that some people have potentially been taking shortcuts. We've really got to try and emphasize how we support our students so they don't make mistakes again in the future. The next key thing, and this is it's a point very much to do with appeals for outcomes, is reviewing your institutional policies and making sure that your new approach is compliant with them. I think there's, according to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator here in the UK, it's about 20% of appeals for academic misconduct panels are upheld. The vast majority are when a university hasn't followed its own kind of policies and procedures. So making sure that whatever you do lines up with the official line and documentation on these matters. And definitely being aware of the practical challenges for online misconduct panels. As you said, you can have a fantastic communication tool, but if you're not using it effectively, it undermines the entire process. And just some final thoughts. There will always be an issue with misconduct. Student cheating is not new. It's not going to go away. It's always going to be a part of education, no matter what you try and do. The key thing is to try and foster and develop academic integrity among your students, pointing out that sometimes people do get things wrong, but the thing is making sure they don't do it again in the future, helping them to focus on the skills that they develop, not just cutting corners so that they get a good grade, basically. And kind of one of my favorite sayings is that this area, or this arena, if you will, is an arms race. So there is always going to be new challenges for us to respond to. We'll get very good at plagiarism detection from the Turnitin similarity reports. Students, or some students, might find new ways of cutting corners. You've always got to make sure that you are up to date, looking for changes in the area, and making sure that you're, kind of up to date with the training that's available from people like Turnitin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Mark. So we have around just over 5 minutes to take a look at our Q&A. So I'll just stop sharing again and see how many we can get through in that time. So we have a question from Julius Matsico, and he asks, how do you handle students that miss a particular panel session even when they are scheduled?
So under our institutional regulations, we are allowed to proceed with a panel, assuming that everybody on the panel thinks that there is no definite reason why the student needs to be present. So if we feel that, particularly in cases of collusion, where there's one student who's potentially used another student's work, we try and ensure that both students are in attendance. If a student is unable to attend, we normally proceed with the panel unless there's a very, very good reason why we can't.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we've had a few similar questions relating to recording the panel hearing. What's your views on recording? Do you do that in Nottingham Trent? And how do you deal with the legalities surrounding a recording?
So we don't record the panels at Nottingham Trent due to those legal concerns. What we do is we have a member of our administrative staff in every single meeting, and they take detailed notes on what is actually said by the panelists, by the student representatives, by the chairs. And what we do is we have an outcome letter that's sent to the students within 3 working days after the panel. But then we also produce a detailed, what's called Board of Examiners report. Now this details pretty much everything that happened in the panel in a lot of detail. And it's obviously incredibly useful to have this information in case there are queries or potential appeals. So yeah. we don't record in the traditional sense, but we have somebody there taking very detailed minutes throughout the entire process.
Perfect. Yeah, I do think that's a pretty safe alternative. And we have another question from Ewan Connor. He said, hi Mark, you said that you ask students to provide a detailed statement in advance of the panel detailing their version of events. We have great difficulty getting students to do that, and usually their responses provide insufficient detail to be of any use to the panel. Do you provide students with a template form or some guidance on how they should provide this?
So we provide them with guidance rather than a template. We did consider using a template, but we thought that it would just end up with some quite generic information being submitted by the student. Now, the guidance normally, so it's in one of these support booklets that students receive before the panels. And what we ask is students to read through the kind of summary of the staff allegations. We ask them to provide information on what they think has happened. We encourage them to consult with our students' union so that they can get advice on what to put in the statement. And it's literally just kind of summarizing their version of events. The average statement is maybe 1.5 pages to 2 pages from the student. Some of this information is to do with personal circumstances, but some of it's actually incredibly enlightening. We've had a few where students have said, I accidentally submitted the wrong document, which was then picked up by Turnitin. And we've been able to investigate this and actually cancel the panel before it takes place because students have detailed the issue and explained what's happened. It's been really useful.
So it's actually managed to save you time in the process. You haven't had to go through this panel here and unnecessarily because of that statement.
Absolutely. Only when there's definitive evidence that this has happened. And obviously it's great for efficiency and really great that we don't have to bring a student into a panel. Absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question because we have had a few people ask the same question. Is relating to the point that you made about not forcing students to appear on video. Obviously, you're dealing with a lot of students. You're not going to maybe know what their voice sounds like. How do you verify the identity of the students in a panel hearing?
So this is one of the points we're giving very serious consideration to for next year. So of the 60-some panels we've only had 3 or 4 where students haven't actually dialed in using their cameras. Now, in each of those cases, we've been fortunate that the member of staff who's presenting the school's position or the evidence actually knows the student and recognizes their voices, and they're able to confirm that it is who, the student on the other end of the line is actually the student in question.
Yeah.
Going forward, I've got to say, I'm actually leaning towards, we're considering making it mandatory to use the cameras just for this very reason. So it is a potential issue of what's called personation, which is where a student impersonates another individual. And we've never had this in a face-to-face panel, but there's the potential for it in an online panel. So I agree with this issue, and I think we're leaning towards making camera use mandatory for next year.
Yeah, it would be really interesting, even as a follow-up, just to see how things do change as you move from this year to the next as well. And I know we have a lot more questions that I'm not going to be able to get to, so I may be able to pass those questions to you and we can work together to follow up on them, possibly by email, possibly in a blog post, something of that nature. But I just want to advise that the questions that you have all asked will be followed up within the next few weeks. So thank you very much for that, Mark. All of your answers have been excellent, and I'm sure they've been very helpful, especially based on all of the questions that we've had. I'm just going to share my screen again for the final time. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, this episode is the second even in a 3-part series, and we'd love for you to join us over the next week for our upcoming episodes. So week today we'll be joined by Sandy Dan and Kit Messenger from Loughborough University, who'll be discussing the importance of partnering with the student union to uphold academic integrity and just using that student voice to encourage integrity. And also our newest solution, Turnitin Originality, it launched today, which is really exciting. So if you'd like to find out more about this, our bonus episode, Incorporating Integrity into Instructional Workflows, will offer a detailed overview of this new solution, and that's at 4 p.m. today, British Summer Time. So if you would like to sign up for any of those, just visit go.turnitin.com/TIO, and that will link to any recordings from last week as well. And that brings us to the end. So thank you once again, Mark, for sharing your amazing best practices. And hopefully your tips and advice will be really useful as we approach the new academic year. If anybody does have any questions about what Mark has covered today, in addition to the questions that you've already asked, which we do have a record of, please do take note of the email address on screen, communications-emea@turnitin.com, and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. And again, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you once again, Mark. You've been absolutely fantastic. And have a great day. Thank you. Have a great day. Take care.